May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Before moving here to Knoxville, I was rector of a church in a pretty small suburban town in northern New Jersey. This meant that fairly often, while going about my days, I would run into parishioners at the library, in the line at the pharmacy, in the frozen food section at the grocery store, while buying stamps at the post office, just walking down Main Street. And while I enjoyed these surprise encounters for the most part and their resulting conversations, I have to admit that at times they pushed the boundaries of my very much introverted self. So whenever I felt like I needed to disappear for a while, I would hop on the train and head into the city, into New York City. And there, with millions of other people, I could get lost on the streets and become invisible. Of course, I realized what a privilege it is to be able to slip in and out of sight. I could pretty much choose when I wanted to be seen and when I didn't want to be seen. But there are plenty of people who are desperate to be seen, but still aren't. And in New York, of course, crowds of people rush past homeless women and men sitting under awnings or on doorsteps. And here, even in this very neighborhood, individuals, I see them holding signs at the entrances and exits of I-40, and as they walk along Cedar Bluff Drive, or Cedar Bluff Road. My guess is that to most people, they are largely invisible. One day, though, as I walked through Midtown Manhattan, I saw a man with a cardboard sign. This man was sitting on a step off the side of a busy sidewalk, and he was just part of the city's landscape for most people. But his sign read, "Today is my 27th birthday," which stopped me in my tracks. Because this man went from being practically invisible to being a man with a mother who had given birth to him and named him, a man who had grown and to live 27 years of life. And all of a sudden, to me, he had likes and he had dislikes. He probably had brothers or sisters and presumably childhood friends. I imagine that he had probably blown out birthday candles at one time in his life or another. Knowing about his birthday made him real to me. That cloak of invisibility had been cast off, and I saw him in a very new and real light. Today in our gospel, we meet a similar man, one who is living the life of invisibility, Bartimaeus. He was blind, and in that first century culture, blindness was equivalent to being dead. Sure, Bartimaeus was living, but barely. And he existed very much on the margins of that society, a parasite and a helpless beggar in Jericho, Mark tells us. It's helpful to know that at that time, Jericho was a very large and wealthy city. Think first century New York City. And thanks to, in part, an oasis which provided fruit and balsam in abundance. There'd be crowds of people pouring in and out and through those gates of the city, pedestrians, animals, carts, all loaded up with merchandise and supplies for either sale or trade. So in all likelihood, Bartimaeus would have purposefully picked this busy spot on the street so that he could receive the alms for which he was begging. But for the most part, I'll bet that he was largely unseen, invisible, just part of the landscape. That is, until he started to shout for Jesus' attention, crying out over the noise of the bustling crowd. The crowd desperately tried to keep him quiet, to keep him in his place, but it was no use. It was as if Bartimaeus had a sign that said, "Today is my 27th birthday." Jesus heard his cries. Jesus saw him and invited him to come over out of the shadows and back into community. Notice how Bartimaeus was first brought back into community, and only after that, being returned to community, was he healed of his blindness. But there's more to this story, and it's important I want you to hear this as more than just another healing story from Mark. Of course, there are many healing stories throughout Mark's gospel. But there are also a handful of stories about call, about being called to follow Jesus, about being called to discipleship in Mark. And this is one of those stories as well. Sure, we know about Jesus' call to Peter, Andrew, James, and John when he asked them to drop their nets and follow him, and they did, became his disciples. And you may remember the story of Levi, the tax collector, who Jesus also called to follow him, and Levi left his tax collecting business, and Levi followed him. And while Bartimaeus didn't have much of anything to leave behind, when he heard Jesus' call, he too cast off his only possession, his cloak. He cast it aside to follow Jesus. This is an interesting contrast to the rich man that we met in our gospel just a few weeks ago, who heard Jesus' call but refused to give anything up to follow Jesus. In throwing off his cloak, Bartimaeus welcomed and embraced his new life, a life of both literal and metaphorical vision, the life that Jesus had given him. In throwing off his cloak, Bartimaeus set aside the past and walked into the future with hope and a promise that he would be seen and loved by God. In throwing off his cloak, Bartimaeus moved from being virtually invisible and alone to being a part of the community that followed Jesus. Notice, too, that Bartimaeus never turned back to go pick up his cloak. He just went forward, followed Jesus along the road, and faithfully walked into his future. And the gospel text tells us that's the faith that made him well. And yes, we all have a cloak of some sort. We have something or some things that we carry around and cling to, something that's hard to release, something that weighs us down and distracts us from our spiritual journeys. We have something that maybe we like to hide behind. I like to think back to that moment when we were baptized, in that very moment when there was nothing between us and Jesus, and we were called by name and marked as Christ's own forever. Because in God's eyes, in that moment, we shed any cloak of invisibility. Of course, over and over throughout our lives, we manage to pick up our various cloaks and put them back on. We disappear into whatever it may be, whether it's fear or isolation or just distraction in general by life or anger. Whatever it is, but we always, just like Bartimaeus, have an opportunity to turn back to God, to cry out to the God of compassion and power and presence, and cry out and say, "Have mercy on me," and resume walking in that faith. Now, I believe that this is what Jesus meant when he told Bartimaeus, "Your faith has made you well." I always thought that it was Jesus saying that maybe Bartimaeus' faith was more matured or more perfected than ours. You know, the faith that can move mountains or that can enable you to walk on water. But I think what Jesus is actually saying is that it's the kind of faith which is active, a faith which is exercised, a faith which is growing, a faith which is moving. It's not perfect or completely matured, but it's active and growing and moving. So faith that makes us well is faith that prays for other people. Faith that makes us well is faith that walks through sadness while still holding on to hope. Faith that makes us well is faith that sees and loves others. Faith that makes us well is faith that serves others. So with today's gospel reading from Mark and with Bartimaeus, I want you to consider that today is your birthday. Okay, maybe not 27, but your birthday nonetheless. And we are not invisible. We're actually quite the opposite. We are standing in God's presence. God has given us life. God has named us and claimed us and called us. And God has set us free to release those things that hold us back from God's presence. So lean into that faith with no limits today, because that is the faith that makes us well. Amen.